Welcome to the Mind Money Spectrum podcast, where your hosts, Aaron Agti and Trishul Patel, go beyond traditional finance questions to help you explore how to use your money to achieve the freedom you want in life.
In this episode, Aaron and Trishul discuss the incentives that influence politicians. Naturally, this means addressing campaign finance reform. If a politician's primary goal is to get reelected, he or she may focus on fundraising and nudge, wink, wink, quid pro quos with large donors, rather than working to improve constituent well-being. Aaron and Trishul look at the history of campaign finance laws, including Citizens United. And so they try to find the balance between free speech and allowing PACs to spend unlimited amounts of money. They then discuss a few ideas for improvement, including voting with dollars, anonymizing donations, and the CFR 28 logic puzzle. And now, on to our conversation.
Hi, my name is Aaron Agti. I'm a financial advisor in the Bay Area, and I'm here with Trishul Patel, a wealth manager on the East Coast.
Hey, Aaron, great to be here today, and thanks everybody for listening.
Great to be here as well. So last week we were talking about voting and the election coming up, and one of the things that Trish and I were talking about afterwards was campaign finance and campaign finance reform. And I had kind of mentioned the idea that one of the things I've been thinking about for a long time, and more in casual conversations, and it's not going to surprise you because it's come out in other aspects, but I tend to think about kind of human behavior and how incentives influence behavior. And when it comes to politics, I think that really does impact many of the political decisions, and big part because, as Trishul mentioned previously, we are in a democratic republic where we don't have every person vote on every issue. We vote on the representatives who will go to Congress or the political political body that's going to enact those laws, and we're choosing our representatives to then vote on various issues. And when we think about the kind of, again, human behavior and incentives, in theory, the behavior and the incentives for politicians, if their goal is to be reelected, they like their position of whether it's power or influence, the ability to affect change. If they like their position and their goal is to be reelected, the incentive, again, in theory, is that they make their constituents happy. If they can improve the lives of the people who voted for that politician, they are more likely to vote for that politician again. So this is a great theory that if politicians do good by their constituents, they get reelected and both parties benefit. However, in practice, it feels a lot more like to get reelected is just who can raise the most money for their campaigns. And it feels like we're now in this situation where the incentives of politicians is to help out those who donate the most money to their campaigns. And Trishul talked about this back when we were talking about the taxes and the ability for lobbying to influence policy. And if you spend $1 billion lobbying to get a $10 billion tax break, it's a good business decision. So today we're going to kind of talk about this idea of campaign finance, incentives for politicians, and kind of how we got here, and maybe some of the ways that we could enact moving forward. So Trishul, for first question for you, kind of, especially given some of the conversations we've had in the past, when you think about campaign finance or campaign finance reform, or just kind of how we got here, where do you start?
You can imagine that if you have a situation where a politician needs money so that they can get the word out, and they're kind of desperate for money, that if somebody gives them a lot of money, they might feel like that individual or business or entity is a little special in their eyes. And you can imagine how that could potentially nudge, nudge, wink, wink, influence some sort of outcome that might be beneficial to the person giving or entity giving the money to the politician. And didn't take too long for this to become an issue with American politics. We can even look back to the 1800s when we had a situation where there were campaign donations that were sought by representatives or politicians or individuals running for political office. And in fact, that's when the first legislation came out to help restrict campaign finance. It was
So
actually
the late 1800s?
Yeah, so 1890, the Naval Appropriations Bill banned the practice of seeking campaign donations from Navy Yard workers. So it was just an example where potentially there was a situation where politicians were trying to solicit donations and the government officials maybe thought it was unfair, and it was likely unfair, so they put this law out. But
So
then,
is this, if I'm guessing, you said naval yard workers will contribute to campaigns of politicians, and they would hope that when naval ships are being built, that politician will say, you know what, I really like this particular naval yard. I think that we should use, our federal government should hire them to build our ships.
Yeah, I don't know the specifics, but you can imagine situations like that pretty easily. And sooner or later, you had corporations that started to do similar types of things. So in 1907, you had the Tillman Act, where it prohibited corporations and national banks from contributing money directly to presidential and congressional campaigns. But, very soon after that, the law was basically flouted with loopholes. It was so easy to bypass that it might as well not have been there. And that's going to kind of be the story of this cat and mouse game that we're going to be talking about for the next 100 or so years, where a law comes up and then all of a sudden there's a way around it. So this kind of continues even with something known as the Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1910. And this is actually when it required House candidates to disclose campaign spending and the source of all contributions. So this is the first federal campaign disclosure law. So at this point, we have this notion of, okay, if you're going to receive money, you should at least say what you're spending it on and where the money came from. And as you know, there's disclosure laws in place today that found its roots in this particular law. So, over the decades, these types of laws were placed and amended, and loopholes were found, and they were patched up and so on. And it kind of just ended up growing and becoming more cumbersome to deal with, but maybe the loopholes were being covered up in a way that was sensible. Who really knows? But the biggest change that kind of happened is after Watergate, when confidence in our government reached an all-time low. And at that point, the politicians felt like they needed to act to regain the confidence of the citizens in the government. So that's when a sweeping legislation was passed, the Federal Election Campaign Act in 1974. So what this actually did was it established a bipartisan federal election commission to oversee and enforce the law. So now you had this entity that was actually responsible for making oversight. And also it set limits to campaigns. So it had federal contribution limits. At that time, it was like $1,000 for individuals on a single campaign and about $25,000 to all federal candidates. It also said that PACs couldn't contribute more than $5,000 to one campaign. A PAC is a political action committee, so it's like a non-citizen entity designed to funnel money to help a candidate. And these amounts were kind of low. It also set spending caps for the actual candidates to about like 10 million for the primaries and 20 million for the general election. So all of this kind of sounded like sensible things. But you can kind of imagine what happened over the ensuing decades from the 70s and forward. Again, they were just different strategies that were taken up by big money and special interests to kind of get around these types of laws that were put in place. So finally, in 2002, they passed the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. Hopefully, this would be an upgrade, or perhaps the biggest upgrade since the 70s. And here the goal was to, again, just try to limit the influence of big money and try to stop the influence of something known as soft money. And this is, instead of donating directly to a campaign, you can still provide some sort of benefit. Like the term used back then was for party building purposes, again, just nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Even though you're directly benefiting a candidate, it's not direct. It's not a hard contribution. It's a soft contribution. And that pretty much at the time, before the 2002 Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, was an unlimited amount that could be spent. So this kind of puts some handcuffs on that. And then, so actually what ended up happening a few years after that is in 2007, there was a ruling that kind of tore down some components of the 2002 Act. It said some of that was going a little bit too far. And then, in fact, in 2010, you had Citizens United, which was also a Supreme Court ruling, which further tore down some of the aspects of the Act. And it once again allowed for unlimited funding by these political action committees with a nudge, nudge, wink, wink process. So that's kind of led to where we are now. And it seems like this hole kind of still exists. There have been other blows in the meantime to campaign finance reform. And so far, there hasn't been any major fixes that have been put in place, but a few things that have come up as proposals. So that's kind of the short-winded history of how we got to where we are.
Okay. So do you mind going a little more on Citizens United and that Supreme Court decision? My very brief understanding was that it interpreted donations of money as a form of speech, and therefore corporations could kind of, like you say, give unlimited dollars, but I think it had to go to PACs, but that part I'm not quite sure of. Like I thought there were still limits on what you could give to individual campaigns, but the PAC system has kind of allowed them to get around that by either, say, attacking the opponent or talking about a specific issue that will very obviously paint one candidate in a positive light, the other candidate in a negative light, and is almost done in coordination, that nudge, nudge, wink, wink that you mentioned with the nominee, or with the nominee's campaign already. Do I kind of have the gist of Citizens United, or is there something else there?
Yeah, that's pretty much it. So the outcome was that corporations could basically spend unlimited funds on campaign advertising if they're not formally coordinating, air quotes, with a candidate or political party. And the reason this started is it's an important free speech discussion. It actually began with this documentary put out by Citizens United. It's called Hillary the Movie. And here you have it. It's a movie and a documentary. And the notion there is, well, what are you going to do? Ban movies now that talk about a candidate? And that's the free speech discussion. So it's a very interesting conundrum that how can you stop people from talking about candidates and telling information about candidates and expressing their views, even if those expressions come with big dollars behind them? So that's kind of why the decision was so hard to kind of grapple with. And it kind of made sense for both sides, one from a free speech perspective and one from, well, if we don't solve this problem, we're basically allowing unlimited sums of money. to influence our elections. So that's kind of the big crunch that we had to deal with. And what it actually ended up leading to is this notion that, with a 5-4 decision, one justice in favor on the Supreme Court of striking down this ruling and allowing Citizens United to market their documentary is what opened the floodgates to unlimited contributions in our elections by political action committees.
I'm glad you brought up that, or at least dove into that free speech aspect, because I do think that there's something there that kind of has to be considered among friends that are, I would say, somewhere between liberal and very liberal. They kind of consider the Citizens United ruling the worst thing ever. And I'm exaggerating slightly, but it is very easy to see how they come up with that conclusion of this allowed unlimited campaign dollars and allowed corporations to buy elections. That's their take on it. But the free speech component is really important. Like you said, how do we stop people from talking about candidates? And I think that moving forward, it's going to be the social media conversation of how do we stop an individual from expressing their views and expressing their preference of one candidate over another, when that seems to also invite unlimited dollars being spent and apparently foreign influence, where now we have Russian individuals expressing their preference of one candidate over another. And they're doing it in such a coordinated effort that it does seem to be influencing elections. So I'm curious, what are your kind of quick thoughts on the free speech side of how important is it to protect that element of free speech?
It is a tricky decision, and that's why I feel like it's something that has to be thought through in terms of second order and third order effects, because at the end of the day, if we kind of propose a ban on X, Y, and Z, it seems like, well, then they'll just do alpha, beta, gamma in terms of there's always going to be some way to kind of get around these types of things, unless we kind of really think of the end game. What are we trying to do here? And it's kind of reminded me of our last conversation where we said, okay, what's the general point of voting? Well, it's so that the population can have some sort of say on what happens with their government. And the concern with free speech is that with enough dollars, speech can be influenced. And there perhaps is a way around this that still preserves free speech. And I want to get to that with some of these different strategies that have been proposed to kind of shore up or firm up campaign finance. So that there's a bunch of ideas that have been put forward that try to tackle campaign finance reform, but also allow speech to be free. So it seems like there might be a balance, just like how there might be a way to have voting such that everybody can vote for a candidate that they feel is sensible, and that when the actual outcome is decided, it's decided based upon what's most representative of the population, rather than some of the flaws we discussed last week. Well, there's likely a way to have a system where campaigns are financed and politicians are elected, but with the caveat that speech is still free, or as free as possible, but still thoughts and ideas flow freely, and elections are still considered to be fair.
Okay. So before we get to that, I do want to kind of bring back in that idea of incentives, and because I think that's important to remember of why money in a campaign matters. And one counter I've seen that if the incentive is to get reelected, then could we remove that incentive? So you start talking about things like term limits. This is one particular area I think it's worth talking about because it's a way to alter the incentives without necessarily altering the free speech slash campaign contributions conversation. And here I have a good friend who actually worked for a congressperson after college and actually lived in DC, and it's all the kind of aides that you see running around with backpacks and suits through the Capitol. He was one of those assistants, and I trust him when he talks about that term limits would probably do more harm than good, because historically there's been enough consensus building by more experienced politicians, and they tend to work together and negotiate just a little bit more effectively, and kind of almost putting aside the current political environment, which might not be appropriate, but the idea there is that with politicians who have enough experience and have had those negotiations, the negotiation between two sides tends to be less contentious, and there's probably more benefit to keeping the ability for people in Congress to have many terms and not having term limits. But I do think that's looking at other ways to impact incentives beyond just campaign finance. So I want to kind of keep that in mind as we go through some of the ideas that you're going to bring up.
Yeah, I think those are good points. In my mind, it also opens the conversation to like the cousin of, or maybe redheaded stepchild of campaign finance, and that's just the influence of lobbying in general. So this is a separate but very closely related issue where you have organizations that are designed to collect money and use that money to travel around and buddy with politicians. And often this buddy-budding is also tied with donations to campaigns. And then, of course, it sparks the question, well, does this lead to actual influence in legislation? Well, the answer out of any politician's mouth is no, but it's quite likely that the real answer is not decidedly no. It could be that this type of influence is something that should also be a concern as we talk about incentives. For example, the fact that a politician is not subject to insider trading rules that we talked about with our notion of efficient markets, meaning a CEO can come up to a politician and say, hey, by the way, our earnings are X, Y, and Z, and the politician can act on that, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and make a trade and perhaps make a profit. I have this curious chart which I'll throw in the show notes that shows an indicator known as the U.S. Senator sentiment, and it's kind of derived from the insider or the trading activities of our U.S. senators. And it just shows how much they're buying and selling. And then in another line, we have the chart of the S&P. And it's kind of interesting to see patterns of strong buying and selling activity around certain periods that may be correlated or may even predict some movements in the S&P. And the notion is, even if that was happening, it's kind of allowed or sanctioned by our government. The other notion to think about is if you are a government official and you're hanging out with a lobbyist and you happen to have a favorable relationship, well, you can also nudge, nudge, wink, wink after your term, go work for that lobbyist. Now, is there a quid pro quo there of, I finance your campaign, I keep you elected, and when we're done, you have a cushy $400,000 a year salary for life attached to the $1 billion or $10 billion in taxes that I saved. So you can see how this can get, frankly, a bit nefarious if it's left uncontrolled when we talk about this whole notion of moral hazard and incentives.
I think similarly, you see issues where, say, members of the military who are involved in kind of appropriations and the decision-making process at Congress, unfortunately often will go, after they retire from the military, will go work for defense contractors who are benefiting from the contracts they received when that military member was giving recommendations to Congress. Because some of those contracts last many, many years, and they'll still get paid out once the official is no longer employed by the military. And it's important to kind of look at that because that's an incentive issue, but the military official themselves are not elected officials. They are promoted through the ranks to get to that level, but you still see very similar incentive concerns that you would for politicians.
Right. And maybe a question that people might ask is, well, did these floodgates of spending by large special interests actually end up influencing or changing anything since Citizens United? Maybe all of this really just didn't push the needle at all, and it's not a big deal. Or maybe there's some research that suggests otherwise.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some of the kind of ideas or potential ways to not necessarily fix things, but maybe improve things a little bit?
Well, actually, before I get to that, I was teeing up myself to actually talk about that research.
Okay.
So I'll just throw it out there. There has been some research on just looking at the impact of Citizens United and just digging into, has it really made a difference in our electoral process? So there was a study done that came out not too long ago, and the title of the paper was After Citizens United, How Outside Spending Shapes American Democracy. So this was put forward by a few professors representing the University of Chicago, Columbia, and the London School of Economics. And what they tried to do is just see that, or they tried to study the political consequences of lifting the restrictions on funding. And what they surmised, or what they hypothesized, is that perhaps those groups with the largest budgetary expansion, those campaigns allied with groups that had the biggest pockets would probably see the biggest change. And what they ended up finding out is that likely was the case. So based upon their statistical analysis, that they found that likely there was an effect that supported the notion that increasing funding led to a statistical difference in election outcomes.
Okay, so the wealthy and the industries that have the most money and could benefit from lobbying and trying to influence elections are seeing that influence come to fruition. We have kind of enough statistical evidence that, yes, the unlimited lobbying provided by Citizens United is doing exactly what everyone thinks it is.
Right, yeah. So if you look at the chart of the data, you notice a pattern that things look okay until 2010, and then you see just a divergence in influence of money from that point onward. So it could be a correlation, but there's some times when you see a change like this where a causation wouldn't be too hard to infer.
I see. Okay. Okay. So if the kind of theoretical discussion on incentives and behavior plays out as it seems, that yes, it surprises no one that if you give money to a campaign, you end up with more influence over that politician and can influence that politician to benefit you personally. We've also seen that it has actually played out. This is more than just theoretical. With Citizens United, we have some statistical evidence that, yes, the organizations with a lot of money are influencing campaigns and benefiting from spending a lot of that money. So what's next?
Yeah, so what do we do given the free speech interests and the interest of having fair elections? And it's a very tough question because again, we've kind of grappled with this in this country for over 100 years, and who knows if we've made any progress because we're at the point where any amounts of money can be used, even though we have tons and tons of regulations out there to try to curb this behavior and try to keep a lid on money influencing elections. It may not be doing anything. So there are a bunch of ideas, though, that have been put out there. Some of them are ideas that have been around the block for a while, and some of them are actually in response to Citizens United in particular, and they're probably worth considering.
Such as?
Right. So just taking a breath.
Okay, I'm looking forward to this one now. Okay.
Okay, so there's this notion of voting with dollars. And this was put out in a book by two Yale Law School professors, Ackerman and Ayers. And they have this interesting notion of you have a publicly funded voucher where every citizen who's eligible to vote gets $50, and they get to assign those $50 to however they want across, political campaigns. So what that means is, first, it kind of caps the amount of money to something kind of reasonable. But since everybody gets it, you get a total amount of money that kind of equals the amount of money that's being spent each year. So we're not starving the candidates for money so that they can do what they need to do.
Okay.
But,
and so this would be kind of, if we could ban the unlimited corporation dollars, but we're still going to provide a voucher to citizens to provide the same level of funding to the politicians.
Right. Yeah. So it doesn't completely ban, but it sets lower limits on, for example, private donations as well. But the notion is if we do this and we combine it with one other key factor, we may go a long way. So the other key factor is all of the donations are anonymous, or they're anonymized. So what this means is the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, will be the intermediary. They'll take the money or the preferences of the $50 and any other donations, and they'll tally that up, and then they'll slowly churn out that money to the actual political campaigns that were, checked off to receive that money. But the kicker is the campaigns won't know where that money is coming from. So what that does is kind of twofold. One, it reduces the influence of big money a bit. And even if a private donation of big money does seep in, it kind of reduces that influence as well, because the actual political campaign has no way of confirming that big money came from that individual. There's no proof. So at that point, then a politician will be hopefully less influenced to favor any particular special interest because of these donations. So I feel like this might make a good stride in the right direction. It seems to make sense to me.
So could that be done even with, like, the second component done without even the voucher system, where kind of all campaign donations have to go through the FEC to be anonymized. I don't know if making a verb out of making anonymous is a thing, but could the FEC anonymize donations to, again, curb that influence?
I believe it's anonymization.
Anonymization.
Yeah. So it could be, and that might go a good ways. It's probably something that, that one's kind of free a little bit, right? It doesn't cost so much money. But, even the $50 funding, it sounds like a ton of money, but you kind of compare $6 billion to maybe the tens and tens of billions of dollars that big money interests may be influencing our government by, then it's kind of like paying pennies for dollars.
Okay, so that was you have 300 million citizens, $50 each, and we're looking at what, 15 billion?
Well, the quote they have is 6 billion. So above 18, so voting citizens probably.
Okay, that
maybe
makes
another
sense.
caveat or two here and there, but yeah, about
Okay,
6 billion in public financing.
0 here, 0 there.
Yeah, but what was cited by the voting for with dollars research is that about $100 billion in 2020 and 2012 dollars is kind of lost each year through corporate welfare techniques of legislation that doesn't quite benefit the population, but kind of unequally benefits corporations. So that this may help curb things like that.
So if we could both kind of close the loopholes where corporations are currently benefiting financially from past lobbying efforts, if we close those loopholes, that would theoretically free up the money to provide that voucher to citizens. And then also, would we try and stop corporations from making those donations, or would it just now be anonymized?
Right. So there's a few things to think about here, because what we're talking about in this case is donations directly to our campaign. And what we still haven't addressed is this notion of PACs, the notion of a private entity advocating, air quotes, for our campaign without directly contributing. So it seems like voting with dollars will help in some ways, but it does seem like it has some pretty big gaps.
So one of my thoughts was, if we're voting with dollars, I almost want to, like, how is that different from voting for the politician themselves? Is there going to be some, like, thinking about those loopholes in that Kalinowski mentioned, is there going to be some kind of campaign in advance to raise money for the real campaign? We have the fundraising campaign to raise money from that voting with dollars system before the voting for the office.
It could be, or it could be the actual campaign, because what tends to happen now is what we kind of looked at last week is nobody's going to campaign for you, Aaron. I'm sorry, because your vote doesn't matter. But a lot more may campaign for me because I'm in Pennsylvania, as opposed to, your residents in California for the presidential election.
I see. Okay, so we could get theoretically kind of a more even campaigning process as people try to focus on kind of all parties, or as many parties as possible, not just those electoral college swing states. Right,
because now, instead of the politicians going after or campaigning for the big money, they're trying to get every $50 they can. So hopefully they're spreading their interest on a far wider net.
Okay. That appeals to me, being in California.
Yeah, you might get some love from the candidates next time around if this were to be adopted.
Okay, so do you have any guesses on feasibility? And I guess one of the things when I think about these voucher systems, my first comparison mentally is the school vouchers, where instead of automatically going to a public school, the federal or state government will provide all families vouchers for their kids to go to school, and therefore the kids can choose to go to a private or public school. And now the theory is that kids from households with lower incomes could have the money to go to the air quotes better private school in the neighborhood instead of the air quotes poor local public school. So that's kind of the theory, but in practice it ends up becoming a way for wealthier families who already want to send their kids to private school to get the government to help pay for it. So that's kind of what I think of when I hear the vouchers. I'm wondering kind of what's the loophole, or what's the next thing, or the concern of one, just the money, but it sounds like if you can convince people that we're actually saving money, that the vouchers could work financially. But is there a thought of I don't want to say giving more money to people who are going to spend it anyways, but it almost like the voucher word, I feel itself might be a little too loaded to be viable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we need to put the word freedom in there. So freedom monies or freedom contributions, or something like that.
I think it's like your voting dollars. Like,
yeah, your voting dollar.
Something like that. So we need the wordsmith to come up with the right phrase.
Sure.
Here, actually, freedom dollars. That could be a good one. I kind of like that. It's not real dollars. They're freedom dollars.
Right. So maybe something like that. But I think the big takeaway I'd like from this kind of system is that the anonymization. And the reason for that is just like a why not? It's something that, again, you don't need the freedom dollars in the conversation, but it's something that seems like it might make sense just to make things a little less transparent to the politicians in terms of where their money is coming from, so that even though they all say they're not going to be influenced by that money, maybe this will help make that a little easier for them. It kind of relates to the notion that in the late 19th century, there was this notion of vote buying because there wasn't a secret ballot process. So one way to fix that is, well, let's do secret ballots, because before you could pay people to vote and you knew how they voted because that was public information. Well, same thing with the notion of having randomized or anonymized contributions through the freedom dollars, freedom votes.
I was not aware of that history, but that makes a lot of sense. Like, I'll give you $50 if you vote for my candidate, and I'm going to wait until you actually vote and I can see the vote tally in public records. Okay, you voted for my candidate, here's $50. Versus I'll give you $50 and then hope you vote for my candidate, but there's no guarantee once you make that a secret ballot. They come out like, yep, I voted for your candidate, but may not have.
Right. So, it seems like a no-brainer with voting. So maybe it should seem like a no-brainer with campaign contributions. But, I'm sure we'll debate about that for decades. That's the cynic in me.
Okay. So I definitely think there's some good components here. that maybe if they all combine, maybe if we kind of acknowledge the cat and mouse game, then we can try to kind of figure out, again, what are the incentives? How is that driving behavior? How can we modify the incentives? Okay. Is there anything else that you think of that might help?
Well, there is another idea that does seem more appealing to me, or seems like it could be used in conjunction with what we just mentioned. And this is known as CFR 28 logic puzzle.
I'm writing that CFR 28 logic puzzle.
Yeah. So the first thing they need to do is get better marketing on their on their names. But the premise, I think, is quite sensible, because what the logic puzzle did is, the people who designed this notion is, what they did is they went kind of step by step on looking at the series of steps and loopholes and jump arounds that kind of happened in terms of how did we get to where we are, and actually what happened with Citizens United. And they kind of worked backwards on coming up with a way of solving that and kind of tackling that First Amendment issue that we talked about early on. And frankly, what based upon my understanding of CFR 28 logic puzzle, is that it could be an option that can provide a good balance between freedom of speech and allowing more fair elections.
So how does it work?
Right. So the way it works is it's not as complicated as the name.
Okay.
So the notion is, you can have about $445 per individual citizen being allocated or contributed to a given campaign. And those dollars can be spent, and now that you have a cap, it's similar to that public option that we mentioned before, but there's one caveat. In terms of how that money is spent, it can't be used on advertising, but it can be used on political messages where people opt in to see those messages. So that's the key distinction that I think Citizens United was confounded by. Meaning, there's a big difference between Citizens United, the documentary, which is a movie, Hillary the movie, and the commercial for that movie. For example, there should be no issue about seeing a movie about whatever you want, right? That's free speech. However, there should be a little bit more issue of seeing a trailer for that movie when you watch the news. That's unsolicited. It's put in front of you because people had money to pay for it. And that's a distinction that CFR 28 logic puzzle is trying to make. When it's unsolicited, it's an advertisement, and that should be more restricted. So by providing this level of restriction on advertisement, it's a way of saying you can have your free speech, you can create all of the stuff you want. It's just when you go to advertise for a particular candidate, whether it's for a documentary like Hillary the movie, or it's just an ad saying vote for this candidate, that's where the restrictions in terms of money should come into play. So what that says is you can have news, you can have papers, you can have books, you can have all of that. But when you go to kind of provide a lot of that opinion and information and whatnot in an unsolicited manner, that's where there should be a constraint.
Okay. So it sounds like it would also work. So when I think of kind of that movie, I also think of the show West Wing, and not necessarily like advertising during the show, but the show itself had a variety of political messages that were obviously more liberal and democratic, but the kind of choice to watch the show would be that opt-in component versus watching something else and then receiving it being shown an advertisement that you did not choose to participate in.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of the free speech arguments that were put out with Citizens United is, well, what are you going to do? Stop people from publishing books that are politically related, around the time of an election? Or Saturday Night Live, can that just no longer exist during election periods? All of these things that have some maybe political bent to them likely deserve the opportunity to be heard and known about. And it feels like CFR 28 logic puzzle goes some ways with finding a good balance between these two concerns.
Okay. One of the things that I have seen when it comes to kind of campaign finance reform and that could work, I don't know how viable it is to be enacted, will be campaigns funded by the government. And so the basic idea is kind of if you have a certain either polling number of, say, above 5%, or if you are far enough in a single primary, then everyone receives the same X number of dollars from, we'll say, the FEC. That they're going to give every congressional race that is past the primary $5 million, and that's the only spending that campaign can do. Same thing with presidential campaigns, where if you get past a certain primary level or a certain polling number, then there'll be $50 million for the presidential campaign, something like that. And this was an interesting thought because, again, it tries to remove some of those incentives of the money is coming from someone trying to influence that politician. I don't know if it would address any of the kind of Citizens United issues and PACs and messaging, so maybe it has to be done in concert with something, but this would kind of theoretically solve that voucher issue of the voting for dollars. If everyone gets the same amount of money, now you have to actually make better tactical decisions of what's the best use of the limited dollars. And if the Electoral College is still around, maybe it just means that they're only spending money in 4 to 6 states. So you get to see all the ads and I don't get to see any of them, which might actually be a good thing for just life satisfaction and well-being. But I was curious if you had any kind of thoughts on the idea of a government-funded campaign as a way to, I guess it'd be just another form of anonymizing donations.
Yeah, whether it's through the notion of voting with dollars or even the CFR 20 logic puzzle, it could have a public financing component. It's not required, but it could be kind of slotted in there. And I've seen similar notions with this notion of matching funds. This is a concept that's actually out there in a few areas. And the idea there is the government would match the first X amount of every donation, like the first $250 of everybody's donation. Meaning, if you have 1,000 people and one person gives $1 billion to one candidate, but 1,000 give 250 to one, well, then that 250 gets doubled. So now at least you have a greater influence going to more people rather than going to that one billionaire who gave one large donation.
I see. So overweighting the impact of those smaller donations and underweighting the impact of that larger donation.
Yeah, and you can always throw in provisions like CFR 20 logic puzzle has that just says you can't have contributions from non-citizens, meaning no corporations, no anonymous organizations, no foreign nationals. Basically, with right now with Citizens United and in play, you can have dark money, meaning money coming from any of these sources. at any dollar amount influence our election. So the key issue here, though, is what likely will be required is an actual amendment to the Constitution. So it's a pretty big hurdle, but it seems like the election process and shoring that up might be an issue that's important enough that warrants an amendment to the Constitution.
Okay. So anything you want to add before we wrap up?
Well, I just think that the final thing that we may want to target is just this notion of quid pro quo, and what does it actually mean, and perhaps we can put some handcuffs on what might actually be acceptable and not acceptable when it comes to something like this. Because if we leave it too easy to say, I'll do X and we'll hopefully get Y if Z happens, well, it just kind of opens the door for, frankly, corruption. And if we understand the rules of the game and we understand what options there are, it seems like we can do a lot better.
Okay, so even just small incremental steps to really mitigate the quid pro quo might be a good first step. It doesn't have to be a huge sweeping reform all at once.
I think so, yeah.
Based on our past conversations and knowing you, I'm guessing you'd love to do test cases on smaller elections to see if we kind of which policies work out and which ones don't.
It certainly makes sense to take an evidence-based approach. I'll make that plug again.
Evidence-based approach. I've heard you say that a few times.
Right.
Okay. Well, this I learned a lot. So thank you very much for the research on the history of campaign finance and some of the laws trying to address it. So thank you very much, Trishul.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I enjoyed the conversation as well, and I enjoyed digging into all of these topics with you. And thanks, everybody, for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing, do spread the word. Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of the Mind Money Spectrum podcast. Be sure to visit mindmoneyspectrum.com to access the entire library of episodes. Remember, it's not black and white, but the wide spectrum of gray area where you get to pursue the freedoms you want in life. Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and is no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested in directly. Have a nice day.